October 1949. The corner of 138th Street and Lenox Avenue in Harlem was a residential intersection where several apartment buildings stood alongside small businesses: a barber shop, a corner store, a shoe repair shop. On weekday evenings in mid-fall, the area was moderately busy with residents returning home from work, children finishing outdoor play before dinner, people conducting last errands before darkness settled over the neighborhood, and the atmosphere carried the familiar rhythms of working-class urban life, where most residents knew their neighbors and where the patterns of daily activity created a sense of community cohesion despite the economic challenges that affected most families. At 6:45 on this particular Wednesday evening in mid-October, James "Jimmy" Crawford walked north on Lenox Avenue from his job at a furniture warehouse in Lower Manhattan, heading toward his apartment on 139th Street. Jimmy was 38 years old, a black man who had grown up in Charleston, South Carolina, and had moved to Harlem in 1919 at the same time as Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, called Bumpy Johnson, who had been his friend since childhood. Jimmy worked as a warehouse supervisor, managed his finances carefully, avoided involvement in criminal activity, and maintained a quiet life focused on his family and his church. He dressed in work clothes, dark trousers, a jacket over a work shirt, sturdy shoes suitable for the physical labor his job required. As Jimmy approached the intersection of 138th and Lenox, two men who had been standing in a doorway stepped onto the sidewalk and moved to intercept him. The men were white, both in their 30s, wearing suits that suggested organized crime affiliation. Their sudden movement and their deliberate positioning indicated this was not a casual encounter, but a planned interception. One of the men addressed Jimmy by name, confirming that they had identified him specifically rather than selecting him randomly. The man said that Jimmy needed to deliver a message to Bumpy Johnson, and that the message was important enough that Jimmy should understand it clearly before relaying it. The man then said that certain business interests in Harlem had concluded that Johnson's operations needed to operate under different arrangements than the independent structure Johnson had maintained since 1935, and that Johnson needed to accept these new arrangements or face consequences that would affect not just him, but people close to him. The threat was delivered in a tone that was matter-of-fact rather than dramatically menacing, suggesting this was business communication rather than personal antagonism. But the content was clear. Johnson needed to accept subordinate status in someone else's organizational structure, and refusal would create danger for people in Johnson's circle. Jimmy responded that he was not involved in Johnson's business activities, that he worked at a furniture warehouse and had no role in criminal operations, and that delivering threats to Johnson through him made no sense because he had no influence over Johnson's decisions. Jimmy's tone was calm and factual, stating these points as obvious truths rather than as arguments or pleas. The second man, who had been silent until this point, said that Jimmy's role in Johnson's business was not relevant, that what mattered was that Jimmy had been Johnson's friend since childhood, and that Johnson valued his friendship, which made Jimmy useful for communicating messages that Johnson needed to receive. The man then said that Jimmy should deliver the message within 24 hours, and that failure to deliver it would create consequences that Jimmy would not want to experience. After delivering this instruction, the two men walked away south on Lenox Avenue, leaving Jimmy standing on the sidewalk processing what had just occurred. Several other pedestrians had witnessed this interaction from a distance, but had not been close enough to hear the specific words. The presence of white men in suits confronting a black worker in Harlem was noticeable enough that people observed it, but no one intervened. Jimmy continued walking to his apartment, where he found his wife preparing dinner and his 2 children doing homework at the kitchen table. Yet he did not immediately discuss what had happened, instead going through his normal evening routine, washing up from work, changing clothes, sitting down to dinner with his family. But after dinner, after the children had gone to their room to finish homework, Jimmy told his wife about the encounter with the 2 men and the message they wanted him to deliver to Johnson. Jimmy's wife, Margaret, said that Jimmy should call Johnson immediately and relay the message as instructed. And because involvement in conflicts between criminal organizations was dangerous for people who had no capacity to protect themselves. Margaret understood that Johnson had power and resources that Jimmy lacked, and that placing themselves between Johnson and whoever had sent the 2 men created risks that their family could not manage. Jimmy agreed with this assessment and called the telephone number he had for Johnson's business office. And he reached an associate who said Johnson was not immediately available, but that Johnson would return the call later that evening. Jimmy explained that the matter was urgent and involved a threat, and the associate said he would communicate this to Johnson. Johnson called Jimmy back at approximately 9:30 that evening. Jimmy described the encounter with the 2 men, repeated the message they had given about Johnson needing to accept new arrangements or face consequences affecting people close to him, and explained that the men had used Jimmy's friendship with Johnson as the reason for selecting him to deliver the message. Johnson asked several questions about the men's appearance, their exact words, whether they had mentioned any names or organizations, and whether Jimmy had seen them before the encounter. Jimmy answered each question precisely, demonstrating that he had observed the interaction carefully despite the stress it created. After gathering this information, Johnson told Jimmy to continue his normal routine and not to worry about the situation, that Johnson would address it, and that Jimmy and his family would be safe. Johnson's tone throughout this conversation was calm and measured, showing no anger or alarm, treating the threat as something that required attention, but not as a crisis that justified emotional reaction. And Jimmy went to work the next morning as usual, taking the subway to Lower Manhattan and arriving at the furniture warehouse at his regular time. He worked through the morning overseeing the loading and unloading of shipments, managing the warehouse crew, completing paperwork for inventory tracking. At 12:15, during his lunch break, Jimmy walked to a small restaurant near the warehouse where he normally ate lunch. As Jimmy sat at the counter eating a sandwich, the same 2 men who had approached him the previous evening entered the restaurant and sat on either side of him. One of the men said that 24 hours had passed since they gave Jimmy the message to deliver to Johnson, and that they wanted to confirm that Jimmy had delivered it and what Johnson's response had been. Jimmy said that he had spoken with Johnson the previous evening, that he had relayed the message exactly as it had been given, and that Johnson had said he would address the situation. Jimmy stated these facts without embellishment or interpretation, simply reporting what had occurred. The man who had spoken said that Johnson's response was inadequate, that saying he would address the situation was not the same as agreeing to accept the new arrangements, and that clearer acceptance was required. The man then said that Jimmy would receive additional instruction about what message to deliver next, and that this process would continue until Johnson provided the acceptance that was being demanded. Jimmy responded that he had delivered the message as requested, that he had no control over Johnson's decisions or responses, and that using him as an intermediary made no sense because he lacked influence that could affect the outcome. His tone remained factual rather than argumentative, simply stating the reality of his position. The second man said that Jimmy's influence was not the point, that what mattered was that Johnson cared about Jimmy's welfare and that this care created leverage that could be used to motivate Johnson's cooperation. The man then stood up and left the restaurant, followed by his companion, leaving Jimmy to finish his lunch while processing the implications of this second encounter. Jimmy returned to work and completed the afternoon shift. At 5:30, as he walked from the warehouse toward the subway station for his commute home, and the same two men approached him again. This time one of them had a gun visible inside his jacket, positioned so Jimmy could see it, but positioned in a way that would not be immediately obvious to other pedestrians. The man with the visible gun said that the previous communications had been courteous warnings, but that courtesy had limits when cooperation was not provided. He said that Jimmy needed to convince Johnson to accept the new arrangements immediately, and that failure to provide this convincing would result in consequences that evening. Before Jimmy could respond, the man pulled the gun from his jacket and shot Jimmy twice in the chest. Jimmy fell to the sidewalk as the two men walked quickly away west on the street, disappearing around a corner before other pedestrians could react or pursue them. People on the street rushed to Jimmy, calling for police and an ambulance, but Jimmy was unconscious and bleeding severely. An ambulance transported Jimmy to Harlem Hospital, where doctors attempted to stabilize him, but the gunshot wounds had caused internal bleeding that could not be controlled with the medical resources available. Jimmy Crawford died at 7:23 that evening, approximately 90 minutes after being shot. Police investigating the shooting interviewed witnesses who described two white men in suits, but descriptions were not detailed enough to produce useful identification. The shooting appeared to be a professional hit, executed in a manner designed to send a message rather than to remain undetected. The fact that it occurred in broad daylight on a Manhattan street where Jimmy worked, rather than in Harlem, where Johnson operated, suggested that the people responsible wanted to demonstrate they could reach targets anywhere, and wanted Johnson to understand that geographic distance from Harlem provided no protection. And news of Jimmy Crawford's death reached Johnson at approximately 8 o'clock that evening through multiple channels. Police contacts, who informed him that his childhood friend had been killed, associates who heard about the shooting through street networks, and Margaret Crawford, who called Johnson directly after police informed her that her husband was dead. Johnson's immediate response to this news was silence. He sat alone in his office for approximately 30 minutes, making no calls and meeting with no associates, simply processing what had occurred and what it meant. Associates who were present in the building at that time later reported that Johnson's expression showed no anger, no grief, no emotional reaction that they could discern, just focused concentration, suggesting he was thinking through implications and calculating responses. After this 30-minute period of isolated reflection, Johnson began making telephone calls to gather information about who had killed Jimmy Crawford and why. Within several hours, through contacts in various criminal organizations and through law enforcement sources who provided information in exchange for payment or favors, Johnson learned that Jimmy had been killed by associates of the Genovese crime family, acting under orders from a capo named Anthony Russo, who was attempting to force Johnson to accept a new arrangement where Johnson's numbers operations would be managed directly by the Genovese family rather than operating independently with profit sharing, as the 1935 agreement with Lucky Luciano had established. Russo had assumed that Johnson valued his childhood friendship with Jimmy Crawford enough that threatening and ultimately killing Jimmy would create pressure that would force Johnson to accept subordination rather than risk additional harm to people he cared about. Russo had chosen this approach rather than direct confrontation with Johnson because he believed that applying pressure through relationships would be more effective than attempting to pressure Johnson directly, who was known for responding to direct threats with violence. But Russo had miscalculated in several ways. He had underestimated how Johnson would interpret the killing, not as isolated pressure on one individual, but as a systemic challenge to Johnson's position that needed to be addressed comprehensively rather than through limited response to immediate provocation. Russo had also failed to understand that Johnson's strategic thinking operated at a level beyond immediate retaliation. That Johnson would recognize killing Jimmy as part of a broader strategy that needed to be defeated systemically rather than just punished specifically. As Johnson gathered information over the 36 hours following Jimmy's death, he began to understand that Russo's actions represented not just one capo's freelancing, but part of a broader debate within the Genovese family about whether to maintain the 1935 profit-sharing arrangement with Johnson or to attempt direct control of Harlem's operations. Russo had been advocating for direct control and had apparently decided to force the issue by demonstrating that Johnson could be pressured through threats to people outside his organization. Johnson recognized that responding to Jimmy's killing required addressing not just Russo specifically, but the entire strategic challenge that Russo's actions represented. If Johnson simply killed Russo in retaliation, it would not address the underlying question about whether the Genovese family would maintain the 1935 agreement or would attempt to impose direct control. It might even strengthen the position of those within the Genovese family who favored direct control by suggesting that Johnson could not be managed through cooperative arrangements and needed to be suppressed through force. What Johnson needed to do was demonstrate that attempting to impose direct control on Harlem created costs that far exceeded any potential benefits, that the 1935 agreement served Genovese family interests better than the alternative, and that Russo's approach represented bad strategy that damaged rather than advanced family interests. This demonstration required not just eliminating Russo, but systematically dismantling the network of support that made Russo's position possible and creating conditions where the Genovese family leadership would recognize that maintaining the cooperative arrangement served their interests. To develop a strategy that would achieve these objectives, Johnson began building a coalition of people who could provide different forms of pressure and support that would be necessary to address the challenge comprehensively. The first ally Johnson recruited was Meyer Lansky, the Jewish organized crime figure who had worked with both black and Italian criminal organizations and who valued stable business relationships over territorial expansion that created conflict and attracted law enforcement attention. Lansky had extensive connections throughout organized crime and had influence with Genovese family leadership through various joint ventures in gambling operations in Cuba and Las Vegas. Johnson met with Lansky and explained that Anthony Russo had killed Johnson's childhood friend as part of a strategy to force Johnson to accept subordinate status, that this represented a challenge to the 1935 agreement that had kept Harlem stable and profitable for both black and Italian organizations, and that Russo's approach was creating instability that threatened all the business relationships that depended on predictable conditions in New York's criminal economy. Lansky agreed that Russo's actions represented dangerous precedent and agreed to communicate to Genovese family leadership that allowing capos to freelance in ways that violated established agreements created risks that outweighed any potential gains from expanding direct control in Harlem. The second ally was Thomas Bradley, an attorney who handled legal matters for Johnson's organization and who had connections throughout New York's legal system. Bradley's role would be to document Russo's criminal activities comprehensively, creating legal exposure that could be used as leverage with Genovese family leadership. Bradley would also prepare evidence that could be provided to law enforcement if necessary, though the goal was to create the threat of legal action rather than actually involving police, which would be counterproductive for all parties. The third ally was Stephanie St. Clair, who had run Harlem's numbers operations before Johnson took over in the 1930s, and who maintained influence in the community and connections with various business and political figures. St. Clair's role would be to mobilize community pressure that would make Russo's operations in Harlem politically visible and would create the kind of public attention that organized crime families wanted to avoid. And the fourth ally was Malcolm X, who in 1949 was not yet the prominent civil rights leader he would become, but was already a minister at Temple No. 7 and was building influence among black residents. Malcolm had complicated views about Johnson's criminal operations, but recognized that Italian mob attempts to impose direct control over Harlem represented a form of outside domination that was worse than black-controlled operations that at least kept profits circulating within the community. Malcolm agreed to speak about the principle that Harlem should not be subject to outside control, whether that control came from white political structures or from white criminal organizations. With this coalition assembled, Johnson developed a specific strategy for addressing Russo and the network that supported him. The strategy had multiple components that would unfold simultaneously over approximately 3 weeks. But the first component involved comprehensive intelligence gathering about Russo's organization, who worked for him, what operations they conducted, what their vulnerabilities were, who their suppliers and partners were, what connections they had to broader Genovese family operations. Johnson assigned multiple associates to conduct surveillance, to cultivate sources within Russo's organization through payment or persuasion, and to map the complete structure of how Russo's operations functioned. All this intelligence gathering revealed that Russo controlled several operations beyond just the pressure on Johnson: loan sharking in the Bronx, protection rackets targeting Italian businesses in East Harlem, involvement in labor racketeering in the Garment District. Each of these operations involved specific individuals who worked for Russo, specific locations where collections occurred, specific businesses or unions that were being exploited. The intelligence also revealed tensions within Russo's organization: associates who resented Russo's management style, partners who believed they were not receiving fair shares of profits, suppliers who had grievances about payment or treatment. The second component involved systematic disruption of Russo's operations through multiple channels. For the loan sharking operation, Johnson had associates approach borrowers and offer to refinance their loans at lower interest rates, effectively stealing Russo's customers and undermining his revenue stream. For the protection rackets, Johnson had community leaders organize business owners to resist collectively rather than pay individually, creating the same kind of mutual support network that had been effective against protection rackets in Harlem in 1947. For the labor racketeering, Johnson provided information to union reformers who were attempting to remove corrupt leadership, on helping them document the connections between specific union officials and Russo's organization. Each of these disruptions created small losses for Russo: customers leaving the loan sharking operation, businesses refusing protection payments, union officials being exposed and facing internal challenges. Individually, each disruption was manageable, but collectively, they began to create significant revenue losses and operational problems that required Russo to divert attention and resources toward defending his existing operations rather than toward expanding pressure on Johnson. The third component involved targeting key individuals in Russo's organization for removal or conversion. Johnson identified 5 people who were critical to Russo's operations: his primary collector for the loan sharking business, his main enforcer for protection rackets, his connection to corrupt union officials, his supplier for illegal goods, and his accountant who managed finances and record-keeping. For each of these individuals, Johnson developed specific approaches. The loan sharking collector was offered employment in Johnson's organization at higher pay with better working conditions. The enforcer was confronted with evidence of embezzlement and given the choice between being reported to Russo or leaving the organization. The union connection was provided to federal investigators through an anonymous tip that led to his indictment on corruption charges. The supplier was convinced that working with Russo created legal exposure while working with other clients did not. And the accountant was persuaded that maintaining records of illegal operations created vulnerability when those records could be subpoenaed or seized, and was offered assistance in destroying records and leaving the organization. Over approximately 2 weeks, 4 of these 5 key individuals were removed from Russo's organization: 1 by recruitment, 1 by fear, 1 by legal prosecution, 1 by persuasion. This removal created operational disruption that was far more significant than the revenue losses from the business disruptions, because Russo could not easily replace people who had detailed knowledge of operations and established relationships with customers and partners. The fourth component involved creating legal and law enforcement pressure on Russo. Thomas Bradley compiled documentation of Russo's criminal activities based on information provided by sources within Russo's organization and through surveillance that Johnson's associates conducted. This documentation was not immediately provided to law enforcement, but was prepared in a form that could be provided if necessary, creating the threat of prosecution that could be used as leverage. Bradley also identified specific aspects of Russo's operations that violated not just criminal law, but also tax law, labor law, and regulations governing specific industries. These regulatory violations created exposure to multiple forms of government scrutiny beyond just criminal prosecution, multiplying the potential costs that Russo faced if attention was drawn to his activities. The fifth component involved Meyer Lansky communicating to Genovese family leadership about what was happening with Russo's operations. Lansky explained that Russo's attempt to pressure Johnson by killing Johnson's childhood friend had triggered systematic dismantling of Russo's entire operation, that Johnson was methodically destroying Russo's businesses and removing his key personnel, that this conflict was attracting attention that created risk for all Genovese family operations, and that Lansky's casino operations in Cuba and Nevada were being affected by the instability that Russo's freelancing had created. Lansky's message was not a threat, but was a business argument. Russo had created a situation that was damaging Genovese family interests in multiple ways. Revenue losses from Russo's operations being destroyed, attention from law enforcement and community organizations, problems with joint ventures that depended on stable conditions. Stopping this damage required the family to address Russo rather than to support his challenge to Johnson. The sixth component involved community pressure through Stephanie St. Clair and Malcolm X. St. Clair organized public meetings where Harlem residents discussed the impact of Italian mob attempts to impose control on the neighborhood. Malcolm spoke at these meetings about the principle that black communities needed to resist outside domination, whether that domination came from government, from corporations, or from criminal organizations. These meetings created visibility that made Russo's activities politically controversial, and that made it more difficult for the Genovese family to quietly support his operations. These various forms of pressure converged over approximately 3 weeks following Jimmy Crawford's death. Russo's operations were being systematically destroyed through customer theft, business disruption, personnel removal, and community resistance. His key associates were leaving or being removed. His revenue was declining sharply. His reputation within the Genovese family was suffering because other capos observed that his freelance challenge to Johnson had created massive problems without generating any benefits. The breaking point came when Genovese family leadership summoned Russo to a meeting and informed him that his operations were being suspended, that he was being removed from his position as capo, and that he needed to cease all activity that involved Johnson or Harlem. The family leadership had concluded that Russo's approach was too costly, that maintaining the 1935 agreement with Johnson served family interests better than attempting the kind of direct control that Russo advocated, and that Russo's killing of Jimmy Crawford had triggered a response that was damaging the family's interests across multiple operations. Genovese leadership then communicated to Johnson through intermediaries that Russo had been removed from his position and that the family reaffirmed its commitment to the 1935 agreement governing Harlem operations. The communication included an offer. Russo would be made available to Johnson for whatever response Johnson chose to make regarding Jimmy Crawford's death, with the understanding that the family would not protect Russo or retaliate for whatever Johnson decided to do. Johnson accepted this offer. 3 days after Russo was removed from his position, Russo's body was found in an industrial area in Brooklyn with multiple gunshot wounds. The killing was professional and clean, designed to send a message that murdering Johnson's friends created definitive consequences, but not designed to create additional conflict by being ostentatious or disrespectful to the Genovese family. The immediate outcome was that Russo was dead His organization was dismantled. His key personnel were scattered or working for other organizations. His businesses were taken over by other operators, and the challenge to the 1935 agreement was definitively resolved. But the longer-term outcomes were more significant because they established principles and precedents that influenced how criminal operations in Harlem were conducted for decades afterward. And the first principle was that attempting to pressure Johnson through threats to people outside his organization created systematic retaliation that was far more costly than any benefits that could be gained from the pressure. Russo had killed one person, Jimmy Crawford, and the response had been the destruction of Russo's entire organization and Russo's own death. This disproportionate response created deterrent effects that made similar approaches unattractive to anyone who might consider them in the future. The second principle was that the 1935 agreement governing Harlem operations served all parties' interests better than alternatives that involved direct control or constant conflict. The 3-week period during which Johnson dismantled Russo's organization had demonstrated how unstable conditions in New York's criminal economy affected multiple operations beyond just Harlem, creating costs for Italian mob families that extended far beyond the specific revenue from Harlem numbers operations. This demonstration reinforced the value of maintaining stable cooperative arrangements rather than attempting territorial expansion that triggered conflicts. The third principle was that Johnson's power came not just from capacity for violence, but from sophisticated strategic thinking that could mobilize multiple forms of pressure simultaneously. The dismantling of Russo's organization had involved business competition, personnel recruitment, legal pressure, community organizing, and coalition building with figures like Meyer Lansky and Malcolm X. This multi-dimensional approach demonstrated capabilities that commanded respect even from people who might have been inclined to challenge Johnson's position. For the Harlem community, Johnson's response to Jimmy Crawford's death demonstrated protection that extended beyond just managing numbers operations. Jimmy had been an ordinary working man with no involvement in criminal activity, and his murder by Italian mob associates had threatened the principle that Harlem residents should be safe from being used as pressure points in criminal conflicts. Johnson's systematic destruction of Russo's organization and the reaffirmation of the 1935 agreement established that Harlem residents would not be targeted in this way, and that such targeting would trigger comprehensive response. Stephanie St. Clair, reflecting on the incident years later, noted that Johnson's response had demonstrated the kind of strategic sophistication that separated effective leaders from people who simply had capacity for violence. St. Clair emphasized that Johnson had not simply retaliated against Russo, but had systematically dismantled the entire structure that made Russo's position possible, had built coalitions that created multiple forms of pressure, and had achieved outcomes that served community interests while also advancing his own position. Meyer Lansky cited the Russo incident in subsequent years as an example of how criminal organizations could maintain stability through enforcement of agreements rather than through constant warfare. Lansky noted that Johnson's response had been proportionate to the systemic challenge that Russo represented, even though it appeared disproportionate when measured against the immediate provocation of Jimmy Crawford's death. And the proportionality came from recognizing that Russo was challenging the entire framework governing Harlem rather than just killing one person, and that addressing this systemic challenge required systemic response. Malcolm X, whose participation in the community organizing against Russo had been one component of Johnson's coalition strategy, acknowledged that the incident had influenced his thinking about how power operated in urban black communities. Malcolm noted that Johnson had demonstrated that power came from understanding systems and building networks rather than from individual capacity for force, and that this lesson was applicable beyond criminal contexts to civil rights organizing and community development. For Johnson personally, the loss of Jimmy Crawford remained a permanent grief that affected him for the rest of his life. Associates who knew Johnson well reported that he never spoke publicly about Jimmy's death, but that the loss was evident in private moments when Johnson's normally controlled demeanor would show flashes of emotion. Margaret Crawford, Jimmy's widow, remained in contact with Johnson until Johnson's death in 1968, and Johnson provided financial support for the Crawford family over subsequent years. And the systematic dismantling of Russo's organization became legendary in Harlem and throughout New York's criminal networks as an example of how strategic thinking could achieve outcomes that violence alone could never accomplish. The story emphasized that Johnson had not simply killed Russo, but had destroyed Russo's entire power base first, had removed all his key associates, had stolen all his business operations, and had created conditions where the Genovese family viewed Russo as a liability rather than an asset, and only then had killed Russo after he had been completely isolated and stripped of all support. This methodical approach demonstrated patience and strategic discipline that commanded respect across criminal organizations. It showed that Johnson operated on timescales longer than immediate retaliation, that he understood how to dismantle organizational structures rather than just attacking individuals, and that he could mobilize resources across multiple domains simultaneously: business competition, legal pressure, community organizing, coalition building. When Johnson died in July 1968, 19 years after Jimmy Crawford's death, the obituaries and tributes included references to the Russo incident as one of the defining demonstrations of Johnson's strategic capabilities. The story was told as an example of how Johnson had protected Harlem's interests not through dramatic confrontation, but through systematic dismantling of threats that allowed no opportunity for escalation or recovery. The legacy was that power came from understanding systems and building coalitions rather than from individual capacity for violence. That patient, strategic execution achieved better outcomes than immediate emotional reactions. That comprehensive responses to systemic challenges created precedents that deterred future challenges, and that protecting community interests sometimes required demonstrating that violations carried costs so severe that no rational actor would choose to incur them. At the 3-week period during which Johnson dismantled Russo's organization demonstrated that the most effective exercises of power often occurred through processes that were invisible to outside observers until the outcomes became apparent. Most people in Harlem and in New York's criminal networks did not understand what was happening during those 3 weeks. They saw various small incidents and disruptions, but did not recognize the systematic pattern until Russo's organization collapsed and Russo himself was killed. This opacity was itself a source of power because it meant Johnson could operate without triggering defensive responses until his strategy was too far advanced to be effectively countered. By the time Russo and the Genovese family leadership fully understood what Johnson was doing, most of Russo's key personnel had been removed, most of his businesses had been disrupted, and the coalition opposing him had been fully assembled. The quiet nature of Johnson's response, no public declarations, no dramatic confrontations, just systematic pressure building through multiple channels until the target collapsed, became characteristic of how power was understood to work most effectively. The absence of noise did not mean absence of power. Rather, the quietest moves were often the most powerful because they reflected sophisticated coordination and strategic patience that were more threatening than dramatic individual actions. Decades after the incident, when historians and sociologists studied power dynamics in urban criminal organizations, some referenced the Russo incident as an example of how strategic sophistication operated in contexts where formal institutions provided no protection and where power came from informal networks and relationships. The incident demonstrated that even in criminal contexts where violence was available as an option, the most effective leaders were those who could mobilize multiple forms of pressure and could build coalitions that amplified their individual capacity. The story of Jimmy Crawford's death and the systematic destruction of Anthony Russo's organization in response became part of Harlem's understanding of how power worked and how community protection was maintained. It was not the only story that shaped these understandings, but it was one of the clearest examples of strategic thinking creating outcomes that protected community interests while also establishing boundaries that made future violations less likely.